Welcome to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Man, I am really excited about today's episode. I'm talking to Drew Freidman and his new book from Fantagraphics, More Heroes of the Comics. These are biographical and visual representations of great creators from the Golden Age. Heroes from the Comics was the first volume, and it had the obvious people in there, people like Stan Lee, Gil Kane, Jack Kirby, Murphy Anderson, Golden and Silver Age heroes. But in this volume, it's a few more of the forgotten creators that still had interesting contributions to comics' golden age. Drew's a great satirist. You can look at his past works at magazines like Heavy Metal, National Lampoon, Mad Magazine. He's also worked with some of the underground greats from Art Spiegelman and Robert Crumb. He and his brother Josh did some very wicked parodies back in the day, and we talk a bit about those. And, of course, their famous father, Bruce J. Friedman, who wrote Splash, the original Heartbreak Kid, and a wonderful play called Steam Bath. But we also just talk about old pop culture because Drew is one of us in terms of the people that really like to hunt down interesting old pop culture and memorabilia from that period as well. Drew calls himself a traveler, and you might remember when I had Frank Santopadre from the Gilbert Gottfried podcast, he as well referred to it as a traveler, and it was very nice. Both guys said, it's always nice to meet a fellow traveler. But, if you're an old pop culture person, pre-internet pop culture person, you know what it's like in terms of hunting down funny, obscure movies or TV or memorabilia representing that stuff, the toys of your youth. In that pre-internet world, it really was a hunt to find that stuff. Drew is one of those guys. In fact, he is in the midst of a Kickstarter campaign about a documentary on Drew's work, but also Drew's collecting of pop culture, I think, over the years. So it's a really neat documentary, and I really want to see this happen. So pay attention and check out the trailer at Kickstarter, and also we give you links. Chico Needs the Money, or Chico Needs the Money, is the website to go to see the trailer, as well as the Kickstarter pages. So check that all out, and enjoy this conversation with Drew Freidman on today's Word Balloon. It's brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you, League, for your wonderful support through Patreon to subscribe to my show. Word Balloon is free, but if you want to help the cause, think about it. The average comic book maybe takes you 15 minutes to read. I try to give you at least 6 episodes every month of entertainment. So if you can spare the price of a comic book, $1 a month, that's terrific. You can go to patreon.com/wordballoon, or right there on the front page of wordballoon.com, there's a Patreon ad. You can click to that, and that will take you to my page. Thank you very much for your support, League of Word Balloon listeners. Word Balloon is also brought to you by In Stock Trades. At InStockTrades.com, it's December, and there are great deals waiting for you at In Stock Trades on things like the Luke Cage, Iron Fist, and Heroes for Hire trade paperback. Lots of great people have contributed to the Power Man and Iron Fist combination, and certainly when they opened their offices to more Heroes for Hire, the stories only got more interesting. This is a 312-page trade paperback, and it's 50% off, only $12.49. You can get the sensational She-Hulk by John Byrne. Man, what a great run, historic and funny. This collects She-Hulk 31 to 46 and 48 to 50. It is 464 pages, 50% off, just $19.99. You're going to find great books for yourself and possibly some great ideas for holiday gifts at InStockTrades.com. Great prices, great books, and they're waiting for you at In Stock Trades. All right, let's talk to Drew Freidman and talk about more heroes from the comics, his new Fantagraphics book that is out next week. Here's Drew Freidman, now on Word Balloon. Happy to welcome Drew Freidman back to Word Balloon. It's been a long time, but you got a couple interesting books out and a couple projects, and I'm happy to talk about them today. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks, John. It's great to be back with you.
Very excited about the second Fantagraphics book, More Heroes of the Comics. Am I saying the title right?
Yeah, that's basically it. More Heroes of the Comics. It's the sequel to Heroes of the Comics.
Indeed.
So that's my new book. And I think it's not officially out yet. The official release date, at least the Amazon release date, is December 6th, which is coming up in a few days.
Yeah, and I mean that was my hope, was to have us talk before it came out. They kept pushing it back because and of course you were kind enough to send me a a digital copy of the book. And
well, I'll mention why it was pushed back, and this is, I've mentioned this to a few people, but the fact is that it was on board a ship. It was part of $1 billion worth of cargo that was on board a ship, and due to an unpaid tax bill, and it wasn't a tax bill that Fantagraphics owed, they couldn't unload that shipment, so it sat at sea. That my book and about 5 other Fantagraphics books for weeks and weeks until they finally arrived in New York, and they unloaded it. So that's why it's been delayed. It was originally due out in October, so it's finally coming out in December. But it's still a good book. It's still a good book, and I'm still proud of it.
It is a good book, and you should be proud of it. That's great, man. Honestly, I kind of think there's a disconnect, and there aren't as many books about Golden Age writers. I mean, Roy Thomas has that wonderful magazine Alter Ego, and he does with Tomorrow's, and they do interviews. But I don't think a lot of people, younger people, and certainly newer readers of comics, know a lot beyond Siegel and Schuster, Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, of course. And it's great that both volumes really are a wonderful showcase of all these great, Golden Age cartoonists and writers.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Roy is a friend, and he's been very helpful with these books. He's given me some photo reference that I've used, and also put me in touch with a couple of people. And I actually met Roy when I was a kid, because when my dad worked up at Magazine Management, which was, of course, the company that owned Marvel Comics, my dad's boss was Martin Goodman, who was also Stan Lee's wife's cousin's. No, I got it reversed. Okay, Martin Goodman's wife's cousin was Stan Lee, of course. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, I knew Roy back when he was working at Marvel in the late 60s, because I used to visit my dad up there when I was a kid, and then I was an intern up at Marvel in the early 70s for a week, and Roy was very nice to me then too. So we've kept in touch. But we kind of have that same that same fascination with the early creators, and especially with the second book, a lot of people either have never heard of or have forgotten. A lot of these people were new to me as well when I was working on this book. Cross-referencing, looking up one person, and then it would lead to somebody else. I'd say, I got to look into this person. And so there's a lot of people in there. I've heard from a couple of comics experts, like Danny Fingeroff, et cetera, who had never heard of at least a dozen people in this new book. So it's different than the first book, which was more the cream of the crop and the people you would expect, like Kirby and Joe Simon and Stan Lee and Bob Kane and that group.
Yeah, and no, absolutely. There are a lot of names that I hadn't heard of. It's also great to see, too, that there are a few women in there as well in both volumes. And I'm blanking now, but who was the woman I know that worked in the Eisner studio? I don't know if you can recall by.
Well, sure. That was Audrey Bloom.
Yes.
Who, she had a brief career in comics in the early 40s. First, she worked for Eisner Eiger, and then she switched over to work for Eisner doing the Spirit, and when Eisner went to war, she kind of took over the duties as writer.
That's cool.
But then she got married, and supposedly she had an affair with Eisner doing this too.
Wow.
He chronicles in his book The Believer, which I assume you have that book, The Dreamer. Sorry, The Dreamer.
The Dreamer, certainly, I remember that. That's a great autobiographical Eisner book from.
Yep. So
is that Dark Horse or Fantagraphics? I can't remember.
No, that wasn't Fantagraphics. I don't think
probably
Gary
Dark
would have
Horse. Yeah, probably. I think
I'm
Dark
assuming,
Horse.
Yeah. But the woman that the character has an affair with is based on Audrey Bloom, and again, she was a Jewish female writer, early comics writer, one of the first ones, if not the first one, who worked for Main Street Comics, and she's in this book, as well as a few others, some that are kind of oddball choices, including the woman who wrote Strangers on a Train. Her name is escaping me right now.
Yeah, but that's amazing. Yeah, the Hitchcock film. Absolutely, man. Yeah,
well, she worked, and Patricia Highsmith.
Yes.
She worked, again, worked for Timely in the early 40s, and she wrote Captain America and Jack Buster Johnson, if you remember that one.
I don't.
That character.
I love it.
Not so PC anymore, but she wrote that. She wrote for that. And when after the war, she just switched over. She started writing books, and she wrote Strangers on the Train in the late 40s. And, the rest is history. Also, The Talented Mr. Ripley and A Pinch of Salt, I think it's called. And that became the book called Carol, which was a recent movie. But anyway, she started her career in comics, as did Mickey Spillane, of course, who worked also for Timely Comics, wrote for Captain America. and then, switched over to writing his novels later on. So there are people like that, people that, most people wouldn't remember even worked in comics. And then, like, some super obscure people who just, never, didn't even get credit. I mean, their names were never even appeared in a comic book. Like, as you know, people worked with, like, various pseudonyms back then. That's like, it was rare that, anybody knew who was drawing Batman or writing Batman, aside from the name of Bob Kane. And, of course, he did very little on the actual product.
Well, and I remember talking to Gene Colan before he passed away, and he was Adam Austin at DC because he was working for both publishers, DC and Marvel, or National and Atlas maybe at the time, and didn't want the other company to know about it. So,
yeah, there's a lot of that going on. The companies were very protective of the artists, so they didn't really want their names out there. Gene Colan, of course, is in this book. And he's like one guy I wanted to include in the first book. In fact, I sketched him out, and I wasn't happy with it, so I put it aside, which is one of the reasons I did the second book, because there were a lot of people that I felt bad about not including, because I was limited to about 85 for the first book, and finally my deadline approached, and it had to be handed in. So I left out people like Nick Carty, which I felt bad about, and Gene Colan, and Sheldon Moldoff. I mean, there's a long list of people like Irv Novick and Bob Wood, who's actually the final portrait in the new book. Bob Wood, of course, from Crime Does Not Pay. So I had this growing list, and then people were saying, well, why didn't you include, such and such and such and such? So I realized I had enough for a sequel, and the first book sold well enough to warrant a sequel. So, cool. So here it is.
Man, I'm hoping, much like old Jewish comedians, we might get a third book and everything. Cause
I never say never anymore, and I still have a list of people I wasn't able to include. One is Dorothy Wolduff. Wolfuck.
Yes.
Now the reason I left her out, she was the first female editor, mainstream comics for National. But I left her out because I wanted the book to close with Bob Wood, because his was the most notorious story, involving murder and depravity and all that kind of. So I thought that the book closing out with him was just something I wanted to do. So Dorothy would have come after him because the book is alphabetical.
Yes.
So I said, no, let me just hold off on that. Plus, I didn't really want to draw all that hair on her head. She had a giant bouffant. And I said, do I really want to sit here and render all that hair? And also, the other thing was there wasn't great reference on it. There were two images that are online. You can see them right now of her up at the DC offices. But I tried to touch base with her daughter, who's a best-selling author, novelist, and wow. Paul Levitz actually helped. Paul Levitz tried to help me out with getting in touch with her too. One thing I didn't really want to do with this book or the first book or my Jewish comedian books was to have to contact family members of these people and bother them about getting me photographs. I mean, it's my project. I didn't really want to inflict, my project on these people out of the blue. With a couple of exceptions, and we'll discuss one of them in a few minutes. But anyway, so if I do a third book, Dorothy Wolfuck will certainly be in there. But right now I have no plans to do that.
I wonder if your fear of drawing a bouffant, did that ever keep you from drawing like Margaret Thatcher or anybody like that? Because I would imagine you might have that opportunity given all the publications you've drawn for.
I have drawn people with lots of hair. I think I drew Margaret Thatcher years ago for Spy magazine, maybe, or something like that. So I have, sometimes if it's an assignment, you just have to take the assignment. You got to go there. But at this stage of my life, it's do I really want to sit here and render her bouffant for a couple, for a day at least? And it was really a lot of hair. It wasn't just like a Nancy Reagan bouffant or something.
Okay.
It's a lot of hair on her head. Twice the size of her actual head was her hair. And I just didn't feel like taking that on.
That's hilarious. She, honestly, she's a fascinating person because she was in charge of the DC romance books, and man, her career lasted through the 70s, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it did. And I have about 10 women in this book. I mean, certainly there weren't a lot of women who worked in that industry, in the early comic book industry. My book covers, both books cover people who entered that world in the mid-30s when, the first issue of New Fun appeared and Famous Funnies, the original comics, to the mid-50s when EC Comics ended and, the Comics Code it came along, and then comics, to my mind, became somewhat sanitized. And I kind of lose interest in that world at that point, although there's like certainly great things that happened over the next decade or two.
Sure.
So
I was fascinated by your forward in terms of the books that you gravitated to, and it's funny because obviously you weren't alone. You talk about a passion for the Jimmy Olsen books of the 50s as well and 60s,
Mm-hmm.
and and I mean I kind of came to those a little bit later in those 80-page giants and 100-page spectaculars of the 60s and 70s, and that's when I really most of the 70s. That's when I started reading.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the Jimmy Olsens especially because they just got so weird, and they were just like doing anything with them, turning him into a wolfman and a giant or a Nazi or or the Planet of the Capes, which I actually loved. That series in the late '60s which was written by a young Jim Shooter. I think he was 17, but I always loved that.
Yeah,
the Jimmy Olsens I love because they just went beyond just like superhero adventures. They just took this redheaded cub reporter and just did anything with them. They just any kind of situation, and I kind of adapted that when I was doing comics for heavy metal, and that's why I would have the Incredible Shrinking Joe Franklin or Attack of the Giant Stinky Joe Besser and things like that. I would just take these people from the past and just kind of go from take off from the Jimmy Olsen comics. Weirdly as weird as that sounds, but.
No, it worked, man. Absolutely. We talked about the Incredible Shrinking Joe Franklin. I forgot about Stinky Joe Besser. I got to interview him in the very early '80s when I was still in high school and precocious, and kind of doing what Tom Bergeron did with the Stooge interviews. And I got to interview him and then a Stooge director, Ed Burns.
Oh yeah, sure. That's great. I had several opportunities to talk to Joe Besser. He was sent my brother Josh a couple of letters in the early '80s, but. You take things for granted, like, well, he'll be around, and then he wasn't around. But I did visit Emil Sitka, who was the Stooges straight man for a couple of years.
I got to interview him as well. Please go on.
Yeah, he was a sweet guy. So I went to his house with some friends, and we got great pictures, and so I still feel I regret that I never got to visit Larry Fine when he was seeing people, like people were visiting him, and when he was at the old Actors Home in Hollywood, or outside of Hollywood in the early '70s, and so many people I know went to visit him and they posed for photos, and I was out there at the time, with my dad when he was on assignment in Hollywood, but I didn't do that. The one guy we did visit was Groucho Marx. We went to his house and spent the day there. And that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, your dad. We talked about that too. Your dad, was kind of friends with him. You got to go a few times when you were a kid, right?
Well, we went once to his house. My dad kind of traveled in the same circles as Groucho's girlfriend, whose name was Erin Fleming. She's kind of notorious now because she's just smack him around, whack him around a little bit. But we never saw that. We saw a different side of her. But they traveled in the same circles. They had similar friends, and she got along with him at the time. So she invited us to his house for the day. I actually met Groucho, or encountered Groucho twice before then in New York at the show Minnie's Boys, which was the show about the Marx Brothers. 97. Groucho was there in the audience every night, so I approached him and had him sign my playbill. And then at a party, 2 years later, for Groucho was doing ads for Teacher's Scotch. If you remember those ads, full-page ads, they got George Burns, and Jack Benny, and Groucho, old comedians, to pose with this lousy Scotch, Teacher's Scotch, and Groucho. So they had a cocktail party for him in New York. My dad was invited and brought me along, and that's when actually my dad's movie The Heartbreak Kid had just come out, so Groucho connected my dad's name to the guy who the movie is based on my dad's story. So Groucho's, I love The Heartbreak Kid. I just saw it. So he connected. So that's when I went up to Groucho, I was just staring at him basically, and then we went to his house in '75 when he was 85. And he had several strokes. He was really slowed down. And that was an amazing day for my brothers and I. And my brother Josh wrote about it for New York Magazine Experience. And my brother Kip has written about it as well. So someday I'm going to draw it or do a comic strip about it, I think.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Yeah, I would love
and
to
see that. That's a wonderful memory. Yeah.
Aaron Fleming is in every... I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, please.
No, I was done.
Aaron Fleming is in Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex, but we're afraid to ask, and she is...
There's a brief part. Topless, right?
I forgot if it was topless or not, but I just know it's the scene where Felix Unger's from the brain, and Woody is the insecure sperm, and she's, the camera is the point of view of the man, and he's looking at Aaron Fleming, the woman, as they're about to have sex, so yeah.
That's right. I don't think she was topless, actually. I take that back. I think she was wearing a bikini top. But she was, Woody Allen was also part of that circle of Groucho friends and like Dick Cavett and stuff. So Erin Fleming was part of that world, and so there she is in that film, and she pops up in maybe a few other films or TV shows briefly and stuff. But we only saw the good side of her. She was very sweet. She was like singing with him at the party when we were there all day. We were there singing along with them his old songs. So we didn't see the dark side, but I certainly know about it.
Yeah, and I know a book. In fact, you've been regularly on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast, semi-regularly. And
I've been on it three times. Yeah.
Only 3?
That's it. Yeah, I think they mentioned my name because Frank is one of my oldest friends, so my name pops up. I've been on 3, but I think I hold the record for most podcast appearances on the Gilbert Gottfried podcast.
Well, so. I've had Frank on. I had Cliff Nesteroff on the show as well, promoting his book. And I love when you pop on, man, because again, as based on our brief few minutes here and stuff, you're a font of great, Hollywood trivia and just live experiences with a lot of these interesting people. And we're going to talk about your the documentary that's being made in a Kickstarter that's going on. Actually, let's talk about that now real fast, because we'll get back to the book because I want to hear about who you had to get a private, go to family to get some information from. But I want to mention this because really reflective of what we're talking about. There's a great documentary that's being made right now, and there's a Kickstarter campaign for it. So please give me the information on that real fast.
Well, the Kickstarter, of course, the campaign is on for another 2 weeks. And if the Kickstarter is successful, then the movie will be made. The movie is a documentary about me and my work, and its title is Vermeer of the Borscht Belt. And it's being directed by an old friend named Kevin Doherty. And Kevin, I first met Kevin 20 years ago. He hired me to do artwork for a CD-ROM he was doing for Simon & Schuster. So, remember CD-ROMs?
Yes, I do. That's awesome.
But Kevin's a fabulous animator, and he's made many music videos, and he's also passionate about my work, and he's been planning this film for several years. And finally mentioned it to me a few months ago, and I said, I trust you to do it, to get it right. So he has a Kickstarter going on right now. And to tap into that Kickstarter and make a pledge, hopefully, whatever you can, it's either VermeerTheBorschtBelt.com, one word, or ChicoNeededTheMoney.com, or one word. Chico needed the money. And that's a phrase that we came up with on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast. But again, Kevin is dedicated to doing this movie, and it's got about 2 weeks left for the Kickstarter. And so far, it's been we've gotten real enthusiastic response to it. A lot of people have signed on, so hopefully it'll be made. I'm going to grant Kevin access to my studio. He'll be filming me here to do interviews, and my wife as well, Kathy, and our dog Darla. So
Lovely.
We'll all be included, and then a lot of people will also hopefully take part, like friends like Gilbert Gottfried and Jeff Ross, Howard Stern, Mark Maron, and people like that, to talk about my work, and also we'll show images of drawings I've done of them. So that should be fun.
Well, that's the thing, man. I mean, your art's been great, and I talked about your collaborations with your brother Josh, and I loved one of my personal favorite stories. We discussed it in a previous podcast. Was your story about the Andy Griffith Show, where a black gentleman runs out of gas in Mayberry, and it's a very dark parody that, man, I can only imagine the grief that you would get if that were to come out today. I can't imagine. I mean, honestly, and it was done in it's a parody. I mean, and I know most reasonable people would see it that way, but it's times change, man, and it's it's great. But again, it's meant to be sharp.
I guess I don't think, maybe I'm naive, I don't think about things like, well, I can't do this subject, or I can't go there anymore. In fact, I've even considered redrawing that because, I look at my old art, I'm not happy with it. I only see the mistakes. Plus, I'm not a big fan of the stipple work I used to do. To me, it seems kind of clunky now, but I know I have, I hear from people who like that work the most, and then other people think, well, it's like, it was like a growing experience of going through that phase and then starting to paint. I finally got bored with it, which is why I kind of put it aside, or I thought maybe I took it as far as I could go with it, and I was kind of repeating the same look. But I wanted to experiment because I think artists should grow, and I admire artists whose work evolves. So But I've actually considered redrawing that Andy Griffith. I don't know if I'll do it, but I kind of look at the panels. If I look at it and say, this could be better, or this likeness could be stronger, or this angle could be different. I really didn't know what I was doing when I did that. That's the first comic strip I did in 1980 or 79. And it ran in Art Spiegelman's Raw in the first issue of that.
Forgive me, that's right. I think I read it in. Is it Any Persons Living or Dead? Is that the name of?
Yeah, that was our first anthology. That came out a couple of years later. That comic, that Andy Griffith comic, actually popped up in a few places early on. In Raw, first issue of Raw, also Harvey Kurtzman's school magazine called Cartoons. Harvey was a teacher of mine at School of Visual Arts, and he did the regular magazine where all the students' work appeared. So it ran in there. It also ran in High Times. So that, for some reason, that particular comic popped up in a bunch of places before it wound up in the anthology, Persons Living or Dead, which is the book with the big Shemp head on the cover.
Yes, Shemp Howard. That's fantastic.
Right.
No, man. Well, I'm really psyched. I saw the trailer at the for the movie at the Kickstarter campaign page. It looks great. And again, you're just like Gilbert, like Frank Santopadre. You're a collector of memorabilia and stories. And I know before a lot of these obscure movies have been popping up on either streaming or DVD, you were one of these guys that I'm sure were hunting for movies in the catalogs in the backs of magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland and the like, all those Warren publications too, where they.
I guess so. Yeah. But it's like probably like similar to you. We had our particular passions when we were kids. It was like
Absolutely.
I like the same things I liked when I was a kid. So I still like the same kind of movies, sure. TV shows. I mean, sometimes I'll look back at something and say, "Boy, that does not hold up." But
yeah, me too.
An example is like I remember I loved Laugh-In when it was originally on late '60s. I loved it. I couldn't miss it. I just watched. And then it came back a decade later, and a friend in East Village had a party, when the first episode aired, the original Laugh-Ins. And I went over there, and we were just all looking at each other like, this used to be funny. It's like, it's not funny. It's just annoying, and, it's not clever. That happens. But, when I was pretty young, really young, it's like I knew what I liked, and I created this, universe in my bedroom where, I was like, I collected comic books and Mad Magazine and Monster magazines, and then, obsessed with watching television and, discovering this world, it was right there in black and white on your TV, and I had, it's just I didn't want to go to school, I didn't want to go to camp or go out and play, I wanted to stay home and watch Soupy Sales and F Troop and the Three Stooges and Our Gang and Popeye and Bugs Bunny and Abbott and Costello and the Bowery Boys, but I had to go to school and all that stuff, so I resented that, but but that was like the world. I just created my own universe, and like a lot of kids, of course.
But then again, that's where all these great, so original faces obviously inspired you. Tor Johnson, I can imagine if you just did a Tor Johnson book. I think you'd have a decent sized volume, wouldn't you?
I've considered a lot of things, and one of them is I think just portraits of Tor Johnson. There's maybe a limited audience for that kind of thing, but Tor's one of these guys. I used to see him his face pop up in old horror films on Chiller Theater in New York or Supernatural Theater, whatever. And Vampire too, and before I even knew what Plan 9 from Outer Space actually was, I would see clips of it, and the clips look so great. He's roaming through graveyards with her, and I thought at the time, I don't know what this film is, but it looks like the greatest film ever made. It's just such beautiful photography, and their faces highlighted by lighting and that graveyard stuff, and just staring at walking towards the camera. And then I had no idea that it was going to finally emerge and people would say it was the worst film ever made. And, maybe it is, but I think it's, I get more enjoyment out of watching that and films like that than, most other films to this day.
Sure. No, it's idiosyncratic. And, well, I think I heard on Gilbert's show as well that, hey, everyone can laugh at Ed Wood. Meanwhile, the guy made 6 movies. Got them made.
He made more than that, and he was he was passionate about what he did. He was
Absolutely.
As sincere and as passionate as Orson Welles, which is what the movie Ed Wood kind of points out when
Yes.
Ed Wood and Orson Welles meet at the end, and they both have that same passion for making movies. One perhaps was a little more adept at it than the other one, but it's but these faces haunted me when I was a kid, and I was put them in kind of file them, and I'm going to do something with do something. Well, Tor Johnson example. Like when I did a comic strip about Tor Johnson, I drew him at home, as like a day in his life, just a day in his life.
Yeah.
And it ran in Robert Crumb's Weirdo magazine, I think, the 4th issue. Now, when I sent him the artwork, he loved it, but he had never heard of Tor Johnson. He wrote me back. I said, I honestly, I'd never heard of Tor Johnson. I said, okay, well, he was a wrestler, an actor, and then I started getting hearing from other people. This is before email, but I would get like letters and stuff from people saying, I can't believe you did a comic strip about Tor Johnson. I thought I was the only person who was aware of Tor Johnson. One of them was from a guy named Eddie Gordetsky, who's become my friend. He's now a Hollywood producer. He produces The Big Bang Theory.
Oh, yeah.
But he wrote me a letter from when he was working at SCTV, saying that, basically. I can't believe that anybody else even knows who Tor Johnson was. And he bought the artwork, and it's still hanging in his living room in Hollywood for that first comic strip about Tor.
That's crazy. And Small World, Eddie worked with a guy named Tom Couch as the junior writer on SCTV, and Tom and I were radio buddies for a long time. We worked 10 years together at one radio station in Chicago, and actually, unfortunately, I succeeded him at a second radio station in Chicago, and it broke my heart because he's a great guy. But he told me about those SCTV days with Eddie and stuff. Well, that's what I mean, man. I mean, honestly, I'm cut from the same cloth as you and Frank and these other guys that Gilbert has on his show that, we're just like fascinated by these faces that we would see on the UHF channels when we were kids, when there were only 5 channels.
Sure. You're a fellow traveler. I always try to seek guys like you out, people who just kind of get it. You don't have to explain. You don't have to,
I'm doing it for the audience.
You don't have to,
they know.
You don't have to explain things. Sorry.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. Exactly.
It's so comfortable to be with people who just kind of, and I get that from Gilbert and Frank. Frank's an old friend, and Gilbert I used to know back in the 80s used to come to my apartment when I was working unannounced with his coat on, and I had a VHS machine. Gilbert did not. So he'd come, and I'd pop on like an old Ed Wood film or a Bela Lugosi film, or especially a Lon Chaney Jr. film. Gilbert's passionate about Lon Chaney Jr. And he'd sit there. We'd both sit there in silence and watch it. And I'd put his coat back on him and send him back to his apartment on Avenue A where he's living with his mother. So we go way back, So when we get together, we actually email, and usually we just email about Lon Chaney Jr. or Lyle Atwell or Dwight Fry or George Zucco. It's like just out of the blue. I mean, with no explanation, we'll just send each other things and just talk about that. Oblivious to whatever else is happening in the rest of the world.
There's a digital channel that runs, I don't know in how many markets, but it's called Decades, and they had a weekend where they were just showing from the 70s celebrity bowling. And it was great, and it was Marty Allen bowling, and Jack Carter.
Jack Carter.
Oh yeah. But the great things were like suddenly you saw Marilyn Maxwell, and I'm like texting my buddy and going, "This was Bob Hope's mistress." I don't know if you're aware.
Sure.
And stuff like that, And it's like,
I used to love that show, and I think Cliff has sent me a couple episodes of that as well. They really hold up.
Yeah, they're hilarious. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Lauren Green and Roy Rogers are about to face Lloyd Bridges and Peter Graves. It's like, okay.
I'm a longtime fan of celebrity bowling shows, and that dates back to Milton Berle hosting Jackpot Bowling in the early 60s, which was one of the biggest flops in the history of television.
Man, I wish I'd seen that. Oh, my God. No, I didn't know
I blogged about it. Just type in Milton Berle Jackpot Bowling, Drew Freidman, you'll see my blog about the whole thing. It was like a huge catastrophe. 10 years earlier, Milton Berle was, Mr. Television,
right.
Mr. Tuesday
The king of television, yeah.
10 years later, in 1961, he was hosting a bowling show. So how the mighty have fallen.
No kidding.
But it's fascinating, and he had celebrity guests on. He has the Ritz brothers, and people come out, they talk, they do shtick with Milton Berle, and then they bowl, for money or for a charity. But Debbie Reynolds pops up, and the Ritz brothers, and it's just like Bobby Darin pops up, early '60s stars.
Sure,
check it out.
Oh no, that's awesome. That's fantastic. I hope some kinescopes survive of that. That would be great to see.
Yeah, they're on YouTube. Yeah, there's some on YouTube.
See, that's
the fascinating thing on YouTube. Just to get back to my book, I have Whitney Ellsworth. Whitney Ellsworth is in the new book. Now,
talk about Whitney Ellsworth. Yes, by all means.
He started as a comics editor for National DC, and then he became the liaison between DC and Hollywood when they decided that Superman should be turned into a film, Superman versus the Mole Men first, and then that evolved into the TV series with George Reeves. So Whitney is portrayed in my book. He's sitting with George Reeves backstage. He was like an on-hands producer at that, at the Adventures of Superman.
Yes.
That show was so huge, such a popular show, that he decided that they would do a version for children and call it Super Pup. So it was like dogs as the Superman characters, basically, Clark Kent, Lois Lane, Perry White, Jimmy Olsen. But how do you do that with dogs? No. So their solution was to hire midgets and build these fiberglass dog heads and pop them on their head, and then dub in the voices, from guys who did cartoon voices.
Sure.
And that was the pilot for Super Pup. Now this thing is on YouTube. If anybody's curious, just go to YouTube, type in Super Pup. You can watch the entire episode. I think it's even in color. But it only went to a pilot. Obviously, it wasn't picked up. It was it didn't quite click. But that was one of that was Whitney Ellsworth's legacy. That's one of his legacies. And then later on, he did a Superboy TV show.
Yes.
After George Reeves died, they tried that, and also just went to a pilot and didn't go beyond that. So,
did you know about Marty Pasco from DC had told me that they approached Jack Larson after George Reeves had died about possibly doing a Jimmy Olsen series and using George Reeves stock footage and right around those scenes. I know, isn't that morbid? And of course, Jack Larson's like, no, no thanks.
Never heard that. That's like when Shemp died, and they made four more shorts with him with Joe Palma filling in for Shemp. Just showing him from the back of his head. And
those
then,
are on YouTube. Those scenes, yes.
Yeah, and splice in some Shemp footage from earlier shorts and stuff. But they were under contract to produce 4 more shots, and Jules White, nothing stopped him from getting it out there. So they're fascinating. And Joe Palma has his fans.
That's amazing.
Fake Shemp.
Exactly. Fake Shemp, exactly. That's amazing. All right. Well, while we're on the book, so tell me about the guy that you had to go to the family and track down.
Again, like I said, one thing I didn't really want to annoy family members, with my book. So I tried to avoid that in most cases. A lot of reference online, a lot of it not good. Some of it just hazy, black and white. That didn't bother me. It was like more of a challenge for me to find a piece of like a out of focus black and white photo and then transform that into a color illustration or at least a face and concoct it. But there was one guy I really wanted to include, and that's because he was the brother of Abe Vigoda, and his name was Bill Vigoda. Now, Abe I got to know a little bit towards the end of his life. Abe would come to some of my parties in New York at the Friars Club and the Society of Illustrators when they had a showing of my old Jewish comedian art. Abe actually came to the opening, posed with over 100 people for photographs. He was very sweet guy, very terrific guy, and as nice as could be. So before he died, I wrote him a letter and asked if I said, Abe, I'd love to include your brother Bill Vigoda in my sequel, More Heroes of the Comics. And I heard back from his daughter, who sent me a photograph, which I didn't love. But then I had my friend John Wendler, who has this knack for coming up with, whatever I need, sent me a photo of Bill Vigoda, smoking a pipe in hunting garb. And that was enough to go on, to build this illustration that I have in the new book of Bill Vigoda. But when researching Bill Vigoda, if researching online counts as research, because that's what I was doing, at some of the comic sites, one of the comic sites said Bill Vigoda was married to a Hy Vigoda, H-Y. I said, that doesn't sound right. There were no women named Hy, H-Y. So, again, went back and researched, and Hy Vigoda turns out to be a third Vigoda brother who also worked in comic books as a writer in the 40s and into the 50s. I had never heard of him. And so at that point, I contacted, Gilbert had a fan. Frank Santopadre told me that one of the podcast fans was Ashley Vigoda. Ashley Vigoda's grandfather was Hy Vigoda.
Wow.
So Ashley actually wrote me and said, I loved your episode on Gilbert and blah, blah. I said, that's great. By the way, do you happen to have any photographs of your grandfather Hy? Because I'd like to include him in my new book. And sure enough, she sent me a great photo of him posed for his wedding in the early 40s, mid-40s. And from that, I used the face reference to build my image of him sitting behind a typewriter. And so we have both Vigoda brothers in the new book. And, people had heard of Bill Vigoda. He was an excellent Archie Comics artist for 30 years, from the 40s to the 70s. But I don't think anybody knew who, like I said, the comics experts like a Danny Fingeroff had never heard of High Vigoda. So we have both Vigoda brothers in the new book, which I'm happy about.
I'm assuming you obviously leaned on Danny, and as you said, Paul Levitz too. That's the great thing, and again, that's something I don't want to see go away from comics, because Levitz and Danny and stuff, they really got to know a lot of these guys before they passed, and certainly Paul even got to work with Gardner Fox.
Oh yeah.
Some of these golden age greats.
Paul goes way back to the early '70s. When I remember seeing him at the Phil Sewell Comic Cons, like selling his fanzine there before he started working with DC. But Danny's been a great help to me. He's actually moderated a couple of talks I've done in the city, and he's terrific. And I also, I lean on Gary Groth, who's like pretty much, he was a good comics expert too, and get his, Gary. When I did the first book, he's the publisher at Fantagraphics, and I was working on it. He said, Drew, I think you should call this book Heroes and Villains of the Comics. And I leaned against that. I was not into that idea because I didn't want to cast a negative light on the title, and also like, okay, well, who's a villain? Like, let people, if anybody in the book is a villain, the first book, and I think there were some, perhaps. Well, he's in the new book, but in the first book, Bob Kane was in there. Say what you will about him, and also Frederick Wortham. I have in the
closes out the book. The first book, absolutely, man.
Right. So I don't know if they were necessarily heroes, but in one way or another, they were a hero. I mean, they had an effect on that business in one way, possibly negative, possibly in one. So that's why those guys were included in that book, and then in the second book, a guy like Victor Fox, or even the notorious publisher of the Eerie magazines from the 60s. Myron Fass.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, because I always associate Jim with those books.
Yeah, Jim Warren's in the book, and Jim Warren's in the book because he wrote me a series of lovely letters when the first book came out. He loved it. And then I started, like I said, I was trying to concentrate on creators who entered the business from the mid-30s to the mid-50s, till around about 55 or so when EC went under. Mm-hmm. Jim Warren started his publishing career a couple of years later, but I think he had such a huge effect on me anyways, publishing those horror comics magazines in the 60s and kind of reviving the whole vibe of EC and using all the same artists and whatnot, even though they were scripted by Archie Goodwin, who did an amazing job, I thought. Yeah. So I thought Jim should be in the second, but he's like the one exception, or a guy who came on a little later, and so I added him, and he's just been really supportive and a sweet guy. And but Myron Fass is also in the book, and he of course started out as a comic book artist, a competent artist, but of course he went on to become a publisher, and what he published was basically like recycling whatever was successful and watering it down and putting out, and becoming, having a huge success at that.
Was he in terms of knockoff examples, or literally lifting old stories and reprinting them?
Not that. We'll say when Mad became successful, he would do a knockoff, like Lunakill. He calls. So when Creepy and Eerie and became popular, he came out with Weird and Tales of Voodoo and Tales of Horror. Basically, and what he did was he took those early stories from the 50s, from the comic books, and reprinted them in black and white, added more blood, because we were into the late 60s, and his comics were not affected by the comics code since they were magazines.
Right.
Well, those are pretty horrific stuff, especially the covers, like bloodletting and horrible, gory covers. But I was buying them when I was a kid, 7, 8 years old. I was buying them and enjoying them, and that's how much my parents were watching what I was bringing in the house.
Well, I was about 10 or 15 years behind you and everything, and doing the same thing in the 70s. I mean, I was buying.
I wasn't even sneaking them in. Yeah, it was just like put in a stack of whatever magazines or comics. And that also applies to Underground Comics and Robert Crumb. I was buying Zap Comics and Bijou Comics when I was 8 years old. And those comics were labeled for adults only, but I would just pick up a stack of them at a bookstore in the city and pop them on the counter with whatever my dad was buying of his, and because he'd look at them and think they were just comic books, and that was it. So by the time I was like 9 years old, I had a huge stack, and so did Josh, of these underground comics with this twisted work by Robert Crumb and S. Clay Wilson and Jay Lynch, etc.
Well, and you mentioned in the foreword of the first book too that your dad obviously as you said earlier, too, worked at Magazine Entertainment, worked next to Stan Lee, did desk next to him, and, he dumped Marvel Comics at your feet. When they came out.
That was basically my childhood. Like he worked at. Stan was in the next office, but every Friday my dad would bring us back a stack of the latest Marvel comics. This was early, during like the dawn of the Silver Age. So we had stacks of Spider-Man and X-Men and Avengers and stacks of them. And, by the time I was, again, 10 years old, I had a huge collection of that stuff. It's like I assumed that was like, it was normal, for me, like just have it, every Friday bring back this stuff. And then when we visited him up at his office, I made a beeline for Marvel Comics, and Stan was like the perfect host. He was very charming and delighted to just take time with me, and especially when he learned I wanted to be an artist. He said that someday Drew is going to work for Marvel, he would pronounce. It didn't quite happen, but, I still have fun.
I was going to say, there's a story in your forward about a week at Marvel. Kind of as
I did that in the early years. It was like a school, like just for my school assignment was to like get a job out there in the real world, doing something, and then write about it. So I asked my dad, like, could you call Stan and ask? They had kind of kept in touch. My dad left magazine management in 1966, so this was 72, I think. So
okay.
I just said, so my dad called him, and so we went up there to visit Stan before I started, and and then the next week I just spent basically the week up there just running errands, picking up artwork for Tony Isabella or hanging around with John Romita or Herb Trimpe or Marie Severin. They were in the artist bullpen that week.
Very cool. Yeah.
So I just absorbed it and just hung around, did, like helped out with like this or that. And it was fun. They paid me for it, I think $50. So I was happy. That was my career. That was my career at Marvel, my entire career.
But you did work for Mad, and did you get a chance to work with Gaines before he passed away?
No, but I knew him because his son Chris went to my high school, so I was friends with Chris Gaines, who sadly died a few years ago.
Oh man,
kind of tragic. He committed suicide. But I also know Bill. Bill Gaines' daughter Wendy, and they when I did a presentation to Society of Illustrators on behalf of the first Heroes of the Comic book. It was fun because we got Bill Gaines' daughters and grandkids came. Will Elder's daughter and son-in-law came. Will Eisner's nephew came. All these people who are like, most of them are past, but we had Al Jaffe up on stage,
Excellent.
Like 96 now.
Yeah.
So we had some of the legends with us, Danny Fingeroff Motter. It was like fun. We had the Mickey Wheeler, who was, grandfather was made the Major, Malcolm, who basically, was one of the guys who started comic books for National, and before he was bought out by Donenfeld and Leibowitz. I'm sure your listeners know all this stuff, but
this is all that Men of Tomorrow stuff that Gerard Jones covers in.
It's an amazing book. He did a beautiful book. Yep.
Yeah.
My book is the books are kind of an extension of what he was doing. Although my books are more about the illustrations. I think the biographies are secondary. And let me also mention that the biographies in the book were research edited by Kevin Doherty, who's making the documentary about me, and he did an amazing job.
Absolutely, great information.
Yeah,
please, go on.
He just came up with stuff I had no idea about, and he went beyond the call of duty as far as researching this book and coming up with these facts about these people. So.
No, it belongs with Gerard Jones, and I know Nikki and Gerard are also working on a biography of the Major, and when that's ready to roll, I'll have them both on the show as well.
That would be great. I'm looking forward to that. And the other book that kind of like instigated that whole interest in the early comics and the early superhero comics and mainstream comics was the Jules Feiffer book from the mid-'60s, The Great Comic Book Heroes.
Yep.
Which I loved. I absorbed that when I was 6 or 7. Jules was a friend of my dad. He would be around the house a lot, do his drawings on napkins. So I had that book. I loved it and studied it and learned about those guys. And so Jules is actually in this new book, More Heroes of the Comics.
Yes.
And, of course, Jules never actually worked for mainstream comic books. But the two reasons he's in there is because he was Will Eisner's assistant in the 40s. And then he wrote this book. They made the Great Comic Book Heroes in the mid '60s. So I felt Jules. I have a younger portrait of Jules Feiffer in this book when he had hair.
Well, and then also, again, like you say, growing up in the 70s, that Pfeiffer's book was one of those few collections. And, God, it was the first time I think I saw a lot of these Golden Age stories. First time I ever saw Plastic Man's origin was in Pfeiffer's book. And, the Captain America origin was in there. At least the version I had. Were the reprints part of his book when it initially came out in the 60s as well?
I believe so. Yeah, I have the original book, but yeah, I believe so. And I think the guy who shot the stats or photo stats for that book was a guy named Jack Adler. And Jack Adler was actually the first person in the new book, More Heroes of the Comet. He's the first image, first biography. And Jack Adler was, of course, a veteran DC national editor, starting in the mid-40s into the 70s. He kind of rose up the ranks. And one of the interesting things about Jack Adler is he's Howard Stern's mother's cousin. So over the years, Howard has talked about Jack Adler, over and over. And Jack was helpful to him when he was a kid, helped him with his high school project that helped him graduate. He loved his Uncle Jack Adler. So I sent Howard a copy of the new book, and he was thrilled. And he got a copy for his parents too, who were related. And he was very touched that, I thought to include Jack Adler. But, Jack Adler's not a household name, but he was certainly a legendary guy in that world, for many years. Yeah,
honestly, having the opportunity to talk to Neil Adams and some of the other late Silver Age, early Bronze Age guys that knew these guys, as bosses and stuff, I get a few of these stories. And, Adler's a perfect example of that, talking to Denny O'Neil. I mean, you mentioned Whitney Ellsworth, the guy he handed off the Superman comics to was Mort Weisinger, and people at least
Mort's in the book too.
Oh, there you go, exactly. And Mort's kind of a notorious. All those great Jimmy Olsen stories were happening under Mort's editorship back in the Silver Age. And it's interesting to watch younger readers react to those Silver Age stories, which were crazy, but also kind of like Mad Magazine. They were reflective of what was going on in pop culture. So we think it's weird that Pat Boone is on a Superman cover, but really it was, or Alan Funtz shows up and there's a candid camera Superman story and stuff. But again, they were just reflecting on pop culture in really the same way that Mad was.
Yeah, you can't avoid that. I mean, you couldn't avoid that back then. They wanted to sell copies as many as possible, so you put popular, performers or TV stars or movie stars on your covers. But I wanted to include Mort because I did, really admire what he did. Goes way back, and he's a character, and he had a great face. So it's a lot of this had to do with who had a great face.
Absolutely.
I left out a few people who were just kind of bland, but first, the art comes first for me. So
who has a bland face? Who has a bland face in comics history? You're like, whatever.
Well, a lot of these guys were just anonymous and nondescript, and guys who looked like you just wouldn't notice.
Okay.
They weren't looking for attention for the most part. A lot of them won't even care about getting rich or anything. Some of them did, but you got a guy like Jack Kirby who never made a hell of a lot of money over the years and worked at his little wooden desk in the basement for all those years creating all that amazing work. But these guys weren't really looking for huge amounts of attention and stuff. They just loved doing that work, which a lot of them started doing when they were teenagers. I think Joe Kubert was 12 when he wound up working at the shop in the late 30s. And I think Johnny Craig, too, was 12. So these guys, there's this whole opportunity opened up for all these artists and writers in the late 30s, and especially after Superman exploded. And it was just a huge opportunity for all these young artists just out of art school or high school to, have their work published. And this... If the door was shut out, if it was hard to become an illustrator for mainstream magazines or pulps or books, newspapers, newspaper comics, this whole world opened up, and it was just all these young talented, not all of them talented, but some of them went on to have amazing careers, as you know.
Sure.
So it just all happened at that time in the mid to late 30s, and that's what I try to capture in this book, which is why I am mainly centering on guys who started during those first 20 years, and some of them like John Buscema started in the late 40s, and but didn't really become huge or big, a fan favorite till the mid late 60s, like that. So I don't include guys like Jim Steranko or Neil Adams or people who came a little later because they started in the 60s and went on to have huge careers. They're not in this book. That's a separate book, which
Sure.
I don't think I'll do. But I've been asked, like, well, how come Neil Adams isn't in? Well, because there's nothing against Neil Adams, but he just began his career a little later. That's all.
Oh, absolutely. No,
I would have loved to include Bernie Wrightson, but the same thing. Just came along a little later, so it's just a different era.
Well, Bernie has an interesting face too. It's always been a hallmark of your stuff. Whether it's been some of the the weird high school yearbook pictures and things like that from way back, and the gangsters that you've done. And I don't want this to sound indelicate, but do you think the mixing of the races, as we've all just kind of calmed down and been a little bit cooler about like all getting together, is actually genetically kind of removing some of the wonderful faces that came across the ocean, back at Ellis Island years and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. But yes, with me, it's about the faces. It's always been about the faces. I'm fascinated by faces.
Sure.
And I love to draw faces. But I also, when I'm doing this work for the new book and for recent work, I also get lost in backgrounds now, and drawing like a shirt or the desk. If you look through the new book and the first Heroes of the Comics book, I really love drawing or imagining even the offices or the working surroundings of these people, like
yes.
Their environment. So I really get into desk lamps and their pencils and their tables and the type of paper they're using, all those little details, like to build up the illustration. So it's the face is the main part, but I also get lost in the backgrounds, and I want to get those right, and it has to be the right kind of lamp, a kind of lamp, desk lamp that would have existed back then in the 30s, 40s, or 50s. So you can't take that stuff for granted. But again, mentioning the movie Vermeer of the Borscht Belt will cover every facet of the work I've done over the years, starting with the comics that I did with my brother Josh and my solo work for heavy metal and Raw and Weirdo, and then evolve into the spy work and then beyond into the magazine work and then the more recent books. So and the old Jewish comedians, and hopefully include some of those old Jewish comedians to discuss their portraits, like Larry Storch, and we're hoping Jerry Lewis agrees to an interview.
Oh, that's
so
great.
The movie, when the movie happens, when the filming commences next year, when the movie happens, it'll cover all that stuff. So it's like a whole hodgepodge of the stuff. I want the movie to mainly be about my work. It's like I don't want it to be a crumb film where it's like going into weird family dynamics.
Yeah, I know. It's heartbreaking. Yeah, that film in particular is really heartbreaking.
Yeah, but I think it's a masterpiece. And,
absolutely.
There's been a couple of great films about artists. I've seen the documentary about Wayne White. I don't know if you've seen that. The artist Wayne White was terrific.
No.
And the guy who made that is actually making a documentary about Gilbert Gottfried right now, following Gilbert Gottfried everywhere.
That's great.
And I think he's driving Gilbert nuts. Because Gilbert is a pretty private guy. He wants to be left alone, and he has this filmmaker following him to every gig he's doing, and filming him at this place and that. I think Gilbert's going a little nuts.
Well,
he wants it to end.
I love the podcast, and I'm really glad again that they're tapping into this showbiz history that could get forgotten very easily. And God, his Larry Storch interview was outstanding. And I also want to point out your illustrations that you've been selling limited prints of a lot of your really, like Phil Silvers and Nat Hiken. Cliff Nesteroff wrote a great essay about Joey Ross from Car 54. Where are you? And I loved your illustration. That was just fantastic. Joey
Ross, King of the Slobs was his blog on that, and that was great. It was as thorough as you could get. Cliff's work is amazing, and before he became famous, I used to admire, love his blogs for WFMU
yes.
over the years.
Yes.
Just obscure show business, comedy history, and it's just his getting into these details, and so finding these rare photos. So he deserves his success with his book, The Comedians, and he's become a good friend. My print site is drewfreidman.net, and then there you can find my prints of people like Frank Zappa and Johnny Cash and Schlitzie and Siegel and Schuster and Muddy Waters and Harvey Kurtzman, just people I like to draw, like from various fields, singers, comedians, actors, etc., writers. So drewfreidman.net, that's the print site.
Outstanding. Yeah, there's really just beautiful stuff that you'd be proud to, put on your wall and everything, because just high class stuff, and yeah, I mean, just the wonderful depictions of these celebrities. It's
Thanks,
fantastic.
John.
No, hey man, you're like you said, I did enjoy your stipple work, but I am more than happy to go on the journey with you as your art evolves. And it's
I always appreciate hearing that. It's like I can hardly look at it now, but I do like, I enjoy hearing when people say, "Oh no, I really like that stuff." So that's nice to hear. It's like I'm happy with that.
Well, yeah, but I can also I can appreciate, because I can go back 20 years and hear an old radio air check of mine and cringe. But hey man, you get better. I mean,
how it is.
10,000, 1,000 drawings, 10,000 hours, Malcolm Gladwell, all that stuff. It's true.
Yeah. Hopefully you get better. Hopefully improve or at least evolve. I don't know about getting better, but evolving anyway. Because I tend to get bored or restless with working, or I just want to try new things. So as far as doing another book on Heroes of the Comics, it's unlikely. I'd rather move on in some other direction. I have a new book planned for next year. It will be a book of portraits. More my recent print work and portrait work,
cool.
Which will include lots of comedians and singers and everyday people as well, and artists. I'm actually working on a portrait of Chris Ware right now, who's one of my favorite artists.
Oh yeah.
And I recently drew Dan Close, and I did a portrait of Charles Burns recently. So I'm drawing more contemporary artists. I'm including them anyway, people I admire. And so they'll be included in this book. This book will be called Drew Freidman's Chosen People, which doesn't mean only going to be. It's not going to only be Jewish people, but that's the title right now.
I like
and
that.
That should be out later next year.
Oh, that's great, man. Oh no, please come back. And seriously, that's great that you managed to get a good depiction of Chris Ware, because anytime I've seen him at conventions, he is so self-conscious. He literally has his head buried in his hands.
Oh, sure.
And it's the funniest thing in the world to watch. And it's like, dude, we all love you. It's okay.
Yeah, well, it's like the kind of crumb kind of vibe going on, where it's like kind of painful to like deal with that stuff. I understand that. I don't really like going to conventions either. You're kind of a sitting duck. I've done a few recently for this book. It's nice to meet people who enjoy my work. But I'm not a big as far as going to convention, I can do an hour or so, but sitting there for the day, it's like it can
Oh no, I hear you, man. No, were you at the New York show? I didn't see you. I didn't know if you.
No, I don't go to that New York show. Fantagraphics, they don't even take a table there. It's not really. To quote Eric Reynolds, the publisher of Fantagraphics, it's not our crowd.
I hear you.
So I don't do the New York show. I went to San Diego 2 years ago, and that was fun. But it's such an avalanche of people and stuff. But we had you go to San Diego, and it's like, okay, over in one corner you see Fantagraphics and Jordan Quarterly and the people that I at least want to hang out with and associate with. But it's like, so if you're willing to bite the bullet and deal with that stuff, but there's a festival called the Mocha Comics Art Festival in New York every year.
Yes.
So next April, I'm going to be a guest there, and what they're going to be doing is going to be showing original art from the Heroes of the Comics books.
Hey,
About
fantastic.
60 of the original pieces will be hanging. And then a month later, the art will go over to the Society of Illustrators and hang there for a while, for a month and a half, in their Mocha gallery. The original art from the Heroes of the Comics will be on loan. So that's coming up. That starts next April, so that should be fun.
Excellent. Before I forget, I wanted to ask about the Jewseum. Am I right? Isn't that
okay.
the comedy museum that you set up?
The Jewseum is my collection. I guess it's a collection of Jewish comedy artifacts, ephemera, and I have thousands of pieces. Now, I don't have this stuff because of the value necessarily. In fact, most people would find a lot of it worthless. But to me, it's of value because I love the comedians that are represented in this stuff. So it's books, it's records, it's games, it's shoelaces, Pinky Lee shoelaces, Milton Berle cigar boxes, Maury Amsterdam frisbee,
wow.
Things like that. Joey Bishop trading cards, stuff that just like kind of like the unexpected stuff. So I have it was actually on display in New York earlier in the year at the Museum of Contemporary Jewish History. And now it's in my studio. So this Jewseum will be featured in the upcoming documentary, Vermeer of the Borscht Belt. The Jewseum will be part of the it's in my studio, so I'm actually looking at it now, part of it. But it continues to grow. And what people, I'm not really a collector, so I don't really seek things out. I don't go to eBay and look for stuff. But what happens now is people will send me things. So, or they'll give me things when I run into them, or bring me things. So, it's very nice. I would never put anything up on eBay. I want this to stay together as a collection. I don't know where it'll wind up someday. But anyway, there it is. So the Jewseum, Drew Freidman's comedy Jewseum, will be featured in this documentary.
That's outstanding.
But thank you for asking.
Oh, no, honestly, man, I remember when you had some sort of public appearance for it, and I approached you then about coming on and saying, hey, man, I'd love to hear about it. And you're like, yeah, let me get this comic book heroes thing out first, and then we'll talk. So
it started. This thing started to expand. The Jewseum started to expand after I had a show at the Society of Illustrators 2 years ago for my old Jewish comedians' artwork, and I had a collection. of this stuff, so I thought that stuff will look nice on display at the Society in cases, which they had supplied. And then from there, just like I said, well, I should add on to it, just to enhance. And then from there, it just started escalating, and so there it is.
That's outstanding, man. Honestly, and we're lucky because you're in New York, I'm in Chicago. It's not as memorabilia surviving as New York is. I always find when I go to Curios and stuff, more interesting things in your city. But that's the thing. It's great that some of that stuff does exist. It's wonderful to see. It's fun. I mean, more Amsterdam Frisbees. Who, obviously, and that's why you got all this stuff. And I think that's terrific, man.
It'll be featured in the film. And my little secret is I'm actually not in New York. I'm in a secret, undisclosed location, which I'm not going to disclose.
That's okay.
But I'm not in New York. Everybody, for some reason, assumes I'm in New York. Maybe I sound like I'm from New York. But I grew up in New York. I lived in New York for many years. But my wife and I do not live in New York now. But
all right.
It will be disclosed where I live in the documentary.
Oh, that's good. More unanswered questions we've always wanted to know. That's
exactly.
great.
All your questions will be answered in this doc.
That's great. Well, honestly, man, no, I'm happy to help you promote it, and I want to see this film happen, and I'm glad to make my audience aware of it as well. And seriously, man, you're always entertaining. Truly, a great storyteller, and I imagine that'll be featured in the documentary as well. But and your art speaks for itself. It's gorgeous stuff, man, and I know. It's tough. Is it tougher now getting, you generate your own books and you generate your own prints and stuff like that, but obviously the magazine business and its decline has to impact guys like you, I'm sure.
I'm not sure it does because I don't pay much attention to it anymore. I'm fortunate enough where I can do my own work and not have to worry about, getting assignments or, waiting for the phone to ring or anything like that anymore. Okay. Occasionally I'll take an assignment. Like when Donald Trump was running for president, I really had an urge to draw him in all his orange vileness. That orange is kind of fading away now, isn't it? Like when you see images of him recently on TV.
Well, yeah, and also just the white circles under his eyes where clearly whatever bronzer he's using and stuff. I mean, it's just
I think the orange they're kind of laying off that stuff. But I had an urge to draw him, and I did draw him. I drew him for Mad one time when he was running.
Yes.
They did a parody of. It was actually a very good concept. It was to take the Imagine back cover of John Lennon looking up in the clouds. And it would be Donald Trump's Imagine. So, go from there. Imagine there's no Muslims. It's easy if you try, etc. So I was happy I did that. But, as far as assignments, if something comes along like Lewis Black for the Village Voice, I did that recently. If somebody I have an urge to draw, I'll take
that'd be great. I'm going to have to look that up. That's excellent.
Already did that. Yeah, that's online. You can see that Lewis Black. I had fun with that. In fact, I heard from Lewis who really enjoyed it.
I bet.
But I try, it's like these days I try to resist that. Like my heart isn't into just taking assignments anymore. And,
I hear you.
I'd rather work on, maybe because I'm getting older, I'd rather work on what I'm more passionate about, my own projects.
Who are the few comedians that were not happy with your drawings as they happen?
Well, there were, most of these guys, the one guy who just didn't like his drawing and asked me to redo it was Jack Carter. But Jack Carter hated,
everything.
He died a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
but he hated everything. It was like everything was negative. Everything was horrible. So I didn't talk to him directly. There was a writer, Ben Schwartz, who was writing a piece for the Los Angeles Times about the Jewish comedian book, who sent Jack Carter a copy. And Jack Carter, he talked to him on phone, he said he hated it. Hated this portrait. He wanted me to redraw him, but he loved the portrait I did of Buddy Hackett and Sid Caesar and other friends of his that are in the book. He loved them. In fact, so we took his quote actually and used that as a quote from the Los Angeles Times.
That's
which is,
cool.
Maybe not so kosher, but that's what we did. But the other guys who were angry about it were were angry because what the Jewish comedians' books, the only text in those books were their real name, their real Jewish name, and then their show business name.
Yes.
So Sid Caesar was upset that we kind of outed his name as Isaac, and Don Rickles was upset that we found out his real name was Archibald. I mean, these guys they want their legacy to like be their comedic name.
That's crazy.
I guess I don't blame them, but they were angry. We heard from some of their, Sid Caesar actually called Fantagraphics and started screaming at the publisher, the late Kim Thompson, who was delighted to like have Sid Caesar on the phone for half an hour, even though Sid Caesar was yelling at him. Even went into Yiddish and German dialects in the yelling. But mainly, I heard from guys who loved. I know we're closing out in a second, but I heard from guys who were in the book who loved the book, and that was Jerry Lewis and Larry Storch and Jerry Stiller, and a lot of these guys came to Abe Vigoda came to the Friars parties that we had for the books, and they celebrated. They were thrilled to be included, and I got nothing but good reaction from those guys.
That's outstanding.
The living guys,
No, I hear you, man. No, and honestly, again, those books are great because really you go through movies and sitcoms and stuff, and it's like, oh, now I finally know who Herbie Fay is. That's fantastic. And a guy that I've always thought was so funny for his, 90 seconds in whatever television show it was. And, now I could put a name to it and everything. And also his real name, his real Jewish name.
I just wanted to present these guys, with their real name. And then, but it was, those books were mainly about the art. And it was basically showing these guys in old age and still they, desperate to be funny. So most of the portraits were close up in your face. Them just like, and when I met them, it basically that was true. They just wanted to still be out there making people laugh in your face, funny, doing the Friars parties with them. It was hard to even get a word in on the microphone when we were talking, because these comedians, once they have an audience, they just don't shut up, or they just click back into their shtick and their jokes, and it was great. It's great to see.
That's awesome.
That's what I wanted to capture in those books.
That's excellent, and I'm sure Lewis Black felt very honored to be part of the pantheon now, man. That's seriously.
He enjoyed his portrait. He enjoyed. Lewis actually said, I normally don't like when I'm drawn, but I like this. So, for whatever reason, he liked it. And I drew him crazed,
yeah, full rant.
Because it was an interview with him about the election, and he was just going nuts about Trump. So I wanted to capture that, his face, his expression. That's online.
I hear you, man. Well, I don't want to keep you, but I'm thrilled that you spent this time, and I do hope you will come back, because there's a million more things I'd love to ask you. So
anytime, John.
All right, hey man, seriously, when the new book is out, please come back, and we'll direct people to the Kickstarter, and certainly it's coming out this coming week. More Heroes of the Comics.
More Heroes to come. I think if you order it now, you'll get it in 2 days. But the official release date is December 6th. December 6th, yeah. So
and also pick up the first volume as well, because there are amazing illustrations and paintings and great thumbnail, but significant historical things about these great golden and silver age creators. So
thank you so much, John. I can't argue with that.
I'll leave it there. That's Drew Freidman. I hope you'll check out More Heroes from the Comics, and also the first book, Heroes from the Comics, both from Fantagraphics. Order them today. Maybe even have your local shop either order it for you or order it online. Excellent books from Drew Freidman, and really great conversation. Glad that he was on today. Word Balloon was brought to you by InStock Trades at InStockTrades.com, where you'll find great books at great prices. And don't forget, if your orders are $50 or more, you'll receive free shipping from InStock Trades. Michael Fife has his trade paperback for Copra. This is round 4, and it's 25% off, just $14.96. You can get Vision Volume 2. Man, if you didn't read Tom King and Kevin Walsh and their amazing story about the Vision, this is the second volume and concludes the 12-issue series, and it is 45% off, $9.89. Let's just check and see what the price is on the first Vision volume. That book is 45% off, just $9.89. So get the full Vision story for under $20 right now in the 2 books at InStockTrades.com. You can also get some amazing things like the Adventure Time original graphic novel Islands, 30% off. It's just $6.99. From Detective Comics, Volume 9, Gordon at War, featuring Pete Tomasi and Ray Fox as writers, and Scott Eaton and Fernando Passarin as the artist. It is 50% off, just $12.49. You can get the Bloodshot Reborn hardcover, Volume 1, featuring Jeff Lemire, Raoul Allen, and various other artists. But this is the beginning of Jeff's run on Bloodshot from Valiant. It is 30% off, just $27.99. Do some of your holiday shopping online at InStockTrades.com, and I think you're going to find some great books at great prices. Thanks again for listening to today's Word Balloon. More coming up. I know I always say that, but December has suddenly become a very roomy month for me. So, and there's so many people that have contacted me and want to come on the show. So strap in, because I think December is going to be a pretty active month here at WordBalloon.com. Talk to you next time. Until then, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2016.